The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the city, turning the concrete into a furnace that made every step feel like walking through fire. Amora Williams wiped sweat from her forehead as she pushed through the glass doors of the corner store, the blast of cool air hitting her like a blessing. At 15, she had learned to navigate the world with quiet confidence, her braided hair catching the fluorescent lights as she moved toward the drink coolers. She wasn't alone in seeking refuge from the heat. Two massive figures had entered just moments before her, John Cena and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, both dripping with sweat from what looked like an intense workout session. Their presence filled the small store, but they moved with surprising gentleness, nodding politely at other customers as they headed toward the refrigerated section. Amora grabbed a cold soda and turned toward the checkout, but something made her freeze. A flash of movement caught her eye, subtle, practiced, almost invisible. Near the jewelry display, a tall white man in civilian clothes was slipping something into his jacket. The motion was smooth, rehearsed, like someone who had done this before, but it was his face that made her blood run cold. She recognized him from the news, Officer Marcus Grayson, the cop who had been all over social media for excessive force complaints. He was supposed to be on suspension, yet here he was, shoplifting like a common criminal. The diamond bracelet disappeared under his jacket as he moved toward the exit. Amora's heart pounded. She could let it go, pretend she hadn't seen anything, avoid the confrontation entirely. That would be the safe choice, the smart choice. Instead, she stepped forward. "Sir, put that back." Her voice cut through the store's ambient noise like a knife. Every head turned. The cashier looked up from her register, confusion flickering across her face. Other customers paused mid-conversation, sensing the sudden tension in the air. Grayson stopped dead in his tracks. Slowly, deliberately, he turned around, his pale eyes finding Amora with the precision of a predator spotting prey. When he saw her, young, black, unflinching, something dark and ugly crossed his features. "Excuse me." His voice was silk wrapped around steel, polite on the surface but carrying an unmistakable threat underneath. "I saw you," Amora said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "You took that bracelet. You slipped it under your jacket." The store fell completely silent. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Cena and Johnson had stopped their own shopping, their attention now fully focused on the unfolding drama. Grayson's smile was cold, calculated. "You better be real sure about that accusation, little girl." The condescension in his voice was like a slap, but Amora didn't flinch. "I am sure. I saw everything." "Do you know who you're talking to?" Grayson took a step closer, his hand moving instinctively to where his badge would normally be clipped. Even in civilian clothes, he carried himself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "I'm talking to someone who just stole something," Amora replied, lifting her chin. "Badge or no badge, that doesn't change what I saw." The air in the store grew thick with tension. Other customers began pulling out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. The cashier's hand hovered over the phone behind the register, uncertain whether to call security or the police, and unsure if calling the police would help when the problem was a police officer. Grayson's facade of politeness began to crack. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and he took another step toward Amora. "Kids like you need to learn when to keep their mouths shut. Kids like me." The phrase hung in the air, loaded with implications that everyone in the store could feel, but no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. "You heard me," Grayson said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Always thinking you're owed something. Always playing the victim. Well, let me tell you something." "The only victim here," Amora interrupted, "is whoever owned that bracelet you're trying to steal." That was when Grayson snapped. The mask of civility fell completely away, revealing the ugly truth underneath. His hand rose slightly, not yet a strike, but a clear threat. His eyes blazed with a fury that had nothing to do with being caught stealing and everything to do with being challenged by someone he considered beneath him. The moment stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Amora stood her ground, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. The other customers watched in horrified fascination. The cashier reached for the phone, and that was when John Cena moved. In two powerful strides, he was between them, his massive frame creating a wall between Grayson and Amora. The officer stumbled backward, his threatening posture suddenly seeming pathetic next to Cena's imposing presence. "You serious right now?" Cena's voice was low, dangerous, carrying the full weight of his barely contained anger. "You're threatening a kid." Dwayne Johnson stepped up beside his friend, completing protective barrier. "She was doing the right thing," he said, his voice steady but filled with steel. "And you got caught." The dynamic in the store shifted completely. What had been a confrontation between a corrupt cop and a teenage girl had suddenly become something much more complicated. Grayson looked around wildly, seeing the phones recording, the witnesses watching, his position of power evaporating like morning mist. With visible reluctance, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the bracelet, tossing it onto the counter with theatrical disgust. "I was going to pay for it," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. As he pushed past Cena toward the exit, he locked eyes with Amora one final time. The hatred there was pure, undiluted, and terrifying. "This isn't over, girl," he said quietly, meant for her ears alone. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The automatic door slid shut behind him, but his words lingered in the air like smoke, carrying a promise that would soon prove all too real. The confrontation in the store should have been the end of it. Amora had done the right thing. The adults had intervened, and justice had prevailed. But as she walked home through the quiet evening streets, the officer's final words echoed in her mind like a curse. "This isn't over." The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful but somehow felt ominous. Amora clutched her cold soda, the condensation making her hands slippery as she navigated the familiar sidewalks of her neighborhood. Every shadow seemed deeper than usual, every parked car a potential threat. She told herself she was being paranoid. Grayson had been caught, humiliated in front of witnesses and cameras. Surely he wouldn't be stupid enough to retaliate. Surely the system would protect her now that everything was out in the open. But even as she tried to rationalize away her fear, she couldn't shake the memory of the pure hatred in his eyes. It wasn't just anger at being caught. It was something far more personal, far more dangerous. The sound of an engine made her look over her shoulder. A black SUV was cruising slowly down the street behind her, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. It could be nothing, just someone looking for a parking space or an address. But something about its deliberate pace made her skin crawl. The vehicle passed her without stopping, turning at the end of the block and disappearing from view. Amora exhaled slowly, telling herself she was jumping at shadows. But then she heard it again, the low rumble of engines, multiple vehicles this time. Two more SUVs and a silver pickup truck appeared at the far end of the street, moving in perfect coordination like a pack of wolves circling their prey. They weren't speeding, weren't making any aggressive moves, but their synchronized movement was more terrifying than any obvious threat could have been. Amora's house was still 2 blocks away, but it might as well have been on the moon. The vehicles stopped, forming a loose perimeter around her position. Doors opened with mechanical precision, and men emerged from the shadows like something out of a nightmare. She recognized the leader immediately. Grayson had changed out of his civilian clothes into dark jeans and a black shirt, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But it was definitely him, and the rage radiating from his posture was unmistakable. The 3 men with him were strangers, but their type was familiar from news reports and social media posts about police corruption. They had the look of off-duty cops or private security, men who had grown comfortable with violence and accustomed to operating outside the law. One had a snake tattoo crawling up his neck. Another wore mirrored sunglasses despite the fading light. The third was massive, well over 6 feet tall, with a kind of muscle that came from years of intimidating people into submission. "Did you really think you could embarrass me like that and just walk away?" Grayson's voice carried clearly across the empty street. "Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" Amora looked around desperately. The street that had seemed familiar and safe just moments before now felt like a trap. No pedestrians, no lights in the windows, no one to witness whatever was about to happen. Her phone was in her pocket, but even if she could call for help, would anyone arrive in time? "I told the truth," she said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "That's not something to be ashamed of." Grayson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth? You turned my life upside down with your truth. My suspension is about to become permanent because of you. My reputation is destroyed. My career is over. Your career should be over. Amora shot back, her fear crystallizing into anger. You're supposed to protect people, not steal from them. Protect people like you. The venom in his voice was unmistakable now. People who think they are owed something just for existing? People who cry victim every chance they get. The racial subtext wasn't subtle anymore. It hung in the air like toxic gas, poisoning everything it touched. Amora had heard this kind of talk before, on news reports, in social media comments, in the whispered conversations of adults who thought children weren't listening. But hearing it directed at her personally, with such naked hatred, was like being struck by lightning. I'm not the victim here, she said. You are. You're the victim of your own choices. That was when Grayson's control finally snapped completely. He lunged forward with animal fury, his hands reaching for her throat. Amora stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to run. The other men closed in, forming a circle that made escape impossible. His grip on her arm was like a vice, and she cried out as he yanked her toward a nearby tree. The bark scraped against her back as he pressed her against it, his face inches from haze. You think you're brave now, he hissed, his breath hot against her face. Let's see how brave you feel when. Hey! The voice exploded across the empty street like a cannon blast, stopping Grayson mid-sentence. He spun around, his grip on Amora loosening just enough for her to breathe. Standing at the edge of the street, silhouetted against the fading daylight, were John Cena and Dwayne Johnson. They weren't running, weren't shouting, but something in their posture radiated such barely controlled fury that even Grayson's hired muscle took an involuntary step backward. I warned you, Cena said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. There was no bluster in it, no theatrical anger, just the cold certainty of someone stating fact. Grayson released Amora completely, his attention now fully focused on the two men walking toward him with deadly purpose. His backup tried to form a defensive line, but even 3 against 2, the odds suddenly didn't look good. You think you can just follow us around? Grayson called out, trying to regain some authority. This is harassment. I could have you arrested. By who? Johnson asked calmly, still advancing. Your buddies? The ones who are probably already investigating you for what happened in the store. The truth of that statement hit Grayson like a physical blow. His support system within the department was crumbling, his allies distancing themselves, his protection evaporating. He was on his own now, and everyone knew it. But that just made him more dangerous. Maybe you can't be arrested, he snarled, pulling a telescoping baton from his belt, but you can sure as hell be taught a lesson. His men followed suit, producing weapons of their own, another baton, a taser, and something that glinted like brass knuckles in the dim light. They spread out, trying to use their numbers' advantage, confident that surprise and superior firepower would carry the day. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. Amora pressed herself against the tree, her heart pounding as she watched the confrontation unfold. The evening air crackled with tension, and she knew that the next few moments would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone involved. The battle lines were drawn, the stage was set, and somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. The first blow came faster than lightning. Grayson's largest accomplice, the bearded giant who had been silent until now, rushed at John Cena with a collapsible baton extended like a sword. He was counting on size and surprise to overwhelm his opponent, but he had gravely miscalculated. Cena moved like water, fluid and precise. He ducked under the wild swing, his years of athletic training evident in every economical movement. As the baton whistled harmlessly over his head, Cena pivoted and drove his fist into his attacker's solar plexus with devastating force. The impact sounded like a gunshot echoing off the empty houses. The giant's eyes went wide, all the air rushing out of his lungs in a single, agonized wheeze. He doubled over, gasping like a landed fish, before Cena's follow-up uppercut sent him flying backward into a parked car. The vehicle's alarm began shrieking, adding a mechanical scream to the chaos unfolding in the street. But Cena wasn't done. As the man slumped against the car's crumpled door, Cena grabbed him by the shirt and hauled him upright with frightening ease. "You like picking on kids," he growled, his voice carrying a menace that made even Grayson step back. "How about you try someone your own size?" Meanwhile, Dwayne Johnson was dealing with his own attackers with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. The man with the snake tattoo had tried to flank him, counting on stealth and the element of surprise. Instead, he found himself caught in Johnson's iron grip, lifted off his feet like a child's toy. Johnson's wrestling background showed in every movement. This wasn't wild brawling. It was controlled violence, each action calculated for maximum effect. He spun the tattooed man in a perfect arc before driving him into the pavement with a thunderous slam that cracked the asphalt. The third attacker, the one with mirrored sunglasses, tried to even the odd with his taser. The electric weapon crackled as he aimed it at Johnson's broad back, the probes firing with mechanical precision. But instead of the satisfying collapse of a stunned victim, the man watched in horror as Johnson simply ripped the wires free and turned to face him. "You really thought that would work?" Johnson asked conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. The taser probes had caught in his shirt rather than his skin, rendering the weapon useless against his massive frame. The man tried to back away, fumbling for a backup weapon, but Johnson was already moving. A single, devastating uppercut lifted the attacker clean off his feet before gravity reclaimed him, depositing him in an unconscious heap beside his companions. Amora watched from her position against the tree, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. The precision, the power, the complete domination. It was like watching lions tear apart a pack of hyenas. But Grayson wasn't finished yet. As his hired muscle lay groaning on the pavement around him, the disgraced officer's face twisted with pure hatred. If he couldn't win through strength, he would find another way. His hand moved toward his belt, and Amora saw the glint of metal. Even suspended from duty, even stripped of his official authority, Grayson had kept one final ace up his sleeve, his service weapon. "Gun!" Amora screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos like a fire alarm. Both Cena and Johnson spun toward Grayson, but he already had the pistol halfway out of its concealed holster. His face was a mask of rage and desperation, the expression of a man who had lost everything and was determined to take someone down with him. Time slowed to a crawl. Amora could see Johnson diving toward Grayson, his massive frame moving with surprising speed. She could see Cena reaching out as if to somehow stop a bullet through sheer will. She could see Grayson's finger tightening on the trigger, his aim wavering between the two men who had destroyed his carefully constructed world. But what Grayson hadn't counted on was Amora herself, the teenager who had stood up to him in the store, who had refused to be intimidated by his threats, who had faced down 4 armed men without backing down. That same girl now grabbed a fallen flashlight from the ground and hurled it with all her strength. The heavy metal cylinder struck Grayson's wrist just as the gun cleared its holster. The weapon spun away into the darkness, discharging harmlessly into the air with a deafening bang that set car alarms wailing for blocks in every direction. Johnson reached Grayson a heartbeat later, tackling him to the ground with the force of an avalanche. The corrupt officer struggled briefly, but it was like a child fighting a mountain. Johnson pinned him effortlessly, one massive hand holding both of Grayson's wrists while the other pressed his face into the pavement. "It's over," Johnson said quietly, his voice carrying absolute finality. "You lost." The sirens that had been distant wails were now deafening roars as police cruisers converged on the street from multiple directions. Red and blue lights painted the scene in alternating colors of blood and bruises, turning the quiet residential block into something out of a war zone. Officers poured out of their vehicles with weapons drawn, shouting orders and trying to make sense of the chaos before them. 3 men lay unconscious or groaning on the pavement. A 4th was pinned beneath Johnson's considerable bulk, and a teenage girl stood against a tree with dirt on her clothes and defiance in her eyes. "Hands up! Everyone on the ground now!" Cena and Johnson immediately raised their hands and stepped back from Grayson, who was now cuffed and being roughly hauled to his feet by 2 officers. There was no resistance, no arguments, just a quiet compliance of men who knew they were on the right side of justice. One of the responding officers, a veteran sergeant with gray streaks in his hair, took one look at Grayson and shook his head in disgust. "Marcus Grayson," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I should have known." "Sergeant Mills," Grayson tried to say, blood running from his split lip. "These men attacked." "Save it." Mills cut him off sharply. "We've got witnesses, video, and enough evidence to bury you so deep you'll need a mining operation to see sunlight again." As the officers took statements and collected evidence, Amara found herself the center of attention. Paramedics checked her for injuries while detectives asked careful questions about what had happened. Through it all, she answered with the same steady honesty that had started this entire confrontation. "He followed me," she said simply. "He threatened me. And when he pulled a gun, I stopped him." One of the detectives, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, knelt down to Amara's level. "You know you probably saved lives tonight, don't you? His and theirs. If that gun had gone off." Amara nodded, but her attention was focused on Grayson as he was loaded into the back of a patrol car. Even cuffed and defeated, he managed to lock eyes with her one final time. The hatred there hadn't diminished. If anything, it burned brighter than ever. As the patrol car pulled away, carrying Grayson toward a reckoning that had been years in the making, Cena and Johnson approached Amara. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving her shaky and exhausted. "You okay?" Cena asked gently, his earlier fury replaced by genuine concern. 3 weeks had passed since the violent confrontation in the street, but for Amara Williams, the world had changed completely. What started as a simple act of conscience in a corner store had snowballed into something far beyond her control or comprehension. Her name was everywhere now. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #AmaraStandsUp and #TeenageHero. News outlets ran features about the brave girl who stood up to police corruption. Civil rights organizations wanted to honor her. Movie producers called her mother asking about rights to her story. But fame was a double-edged sword, and Amara was learning that lesson the hard way. The morning started like many others since the incident, with her mother, Janet Williams, checking the locks on every door and window in their modest house. The threats had started almost immediately after the first news stories broke. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Emails filled with racial slurs and promises of violence. Cars that drove slowly past their house at all hours, their occupants hidden behind tinted windows. "Baby, maybe you should stay home from school today," Janet said, her voice tight with worry as she peered through the kitchen curtains at the empty street. "I don't like the way that van has been parked out there." Amara looked up from her breakfast, following her mother's gaze. The white van had been there for 2 days now, never moving, never showing any signs of life. It could be innocent. Construction workers, delivery drivers, anyone with a legitimate reason to be in the neighborhood. But after everything that had happened, innocence seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. "I can't hide forever, Mom," Amara said, though her own voice betrayed her uncertainty. "If I stop going to school, stop living my life, then they win." Janet turned from the window, her expression a mixture of pride and terror. "You're 15 years old, Amara. You shouldn't have to worry about them winning or losing. You should be worried about homework and boys and whether you made the basketball team." The basketball team. Amara had made it, of course. Her skills on the court had always been her escape from the world's complications. But even that simple joy had been tainted. Half the team treated her like a celebrity, asking for selfies and autographs. The other half seemed resentful, as if a newfound notoriety somehow diminished their own accomplishments. Her phone buzzed with another message, one of dozens she received daily. This one was from a journalist asking for an exclusive interview. Others were from supporters offering encouragement, legal advocates wanting to help, and unfortunately, an equal number from people who wished she had never been born. The doorbell rang, sending both mother and daughter into instant alertness. Janet approached the front door cautiously, her hand hovering over the phone in case she needed to call 911. But when she looked through the peephole, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "It's Detective Morrison," she called to Amara. Detective Sarah Morrison had been the lead investigator on Grayson's case, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for thorough, honest police work. She had become something of an ally to the Williams family, keeping them informed about the legal proceedings and providing security recommendations. "Morning, Mrs. Williams," Morrison said as she stepped inside, her eyes automatically scanning the house of potential threats. "How are we holding up?" "We're managing," Janet replied, though her exhaustion was evident. "Any news on the case?" Morrison's expression grew grave. "That's actually why I'm here. Marcus Grayson made bail yesterday." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Amara felt her stomach drop, the breakfast she had been eating suddenly tasting like cardboard. "How is that possible? He had a gun." He tried to shoot someone. His lawyer argued that he was acting in self-defense, that he felt threatened by Mr. Johnson and Mr. Cena. Morrison explained, her voice reflecting her own disgust at the legal maneuvering. The judge set bail at $2 million, thinking that would keep him locked up. But apparently, Grayson has some very wealthy friends. Janet sank into a chair, her face pale. What does this mean for us? For Mora. It means we need to be extra careful, Morrison said. Grayson's passport has been confiscated and is not allowed to leave the county. He is also under restraining order that prohibits him from coming within 500 yards of Amora or your home. But restraining orders are just pieces of paper, Amora finished, her voice hollow. Morrison nodded grimly. Unfortunately, yes, a man desperate enough to ambush a teenager in the street isn't likely to be stopped by a court order. The detective spent the next hour going over security protocols with the family. New locks, security cameras, emergency contact numbers, escape routes. It was like preparing for war, not living a normal life in suburban America. After Morrison left, Amora sat on her bed, staring at the silver justice pin that had become her trademark. It sat on her dresser like a talisman, a reminder of the moment when she chose to speak up rather than stay silent. But now, looking at it, she wondered if the cost had been worth it. Her phone rang, displaying a number she recognized. Dwayne Johnson. Hey, champion. His familiar voice brought the first smile she had managed all morning. How are you holding up? I've been better, she admitted. Detective Morrison just told us Grayson made bail. There was silence on the other end of the line, and when Johnson spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made her sit up straighter. Amora, I need you to listen to me very carefully. John and I have been keeping an eye on things, and we've heard some concerning rumors. Grayson isn't working alone anymore. He's connected with some very dangerous people, militia groups, white supremacist organizations, people who see you as a symbol of everything they hate. The word sent ice through her veins. What are you saying? I'm saying this might not be over. In fact, it might be getting worse. These people don't just want to hurt you, Amora. They want to make an example of you. Amora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the world settling on her shoulders. Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut. Maybe I should have just let him take that bracelet and walk away. No, Johnson's voice was firm, brooking no argument. Don't you dare think that. What you did was right. What you did was brave. And what you did mattered. The fact that evil people want to punish you for it doesn't make it wrong. But look what it's cost, Amora whispered. My mom can't sleep. I can't go to school without looking over my shoulder. Our whole life has been turned upside down. Yes, it has, Johnson agreed. But look what you've accomplished. Grayson's corruption has been exposed. Other victims have come forward. The entire police department is under investigation. You didn't just stop one theft. Amora, you shone a light into a darkness that had been growing for years. Through her bedroom window, Amora could see the white van still parked across the street. As she watched, the driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. Even at a distance, even after all this time, she recognized the silhouette immediately. Marcus Grayson stood next to the van, his face turned directly toward her house. Even though she was looking at him through a second-story window, she could feel his hatred like heat from a furnace. He made no threatening gestures, no obvious violations of his restraining order. He simply stood there, a reminder that he was watching, waiting, planning. Hey, Amora whispered into the phone. Who's there? Grayson. He's standing right across from my house. Johnson's voice became sharp, urgent. Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'm calling the police and we're on our way. The restraining order says 500 yards, Amora said, her voice surprisingly steady. He's probably just outside that distance. It doesn't matter. He's intimidating a witness. That's a crime. As if he could hear the conversation, Grayson smiled, a cold, predatory expression that promised violence. Then he climbed back into the van and drove away, disappearing around the corner like smoke. But his message had been delivered clearly. The restraining order, the court proceedings, the media attention, none of it mattered. He was still out there, still dangerous, and still determined to make her pay for having the audacity to stand up to him. Amora sank onto her bed, the justice pin catching the light from her dresser. She had thought the hardest part was over, that standing up to Grayson in the store had been the test she needed to pass. Now she was beginning to realize that the real test was just beginning. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday night, jarring Amora awake from restless sleep. Her mother's voice was tight with panic as she answered the phone in the hallway, speaking in the hushed tones that people use when they are trying not to wake the dead or attract unwanted attention. Amora crept to her bedroom door and listened. Through the thin walls, she could hear fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. "What do you mean they are organized?" her mother whispered. "How many?" A pause. "Dear God." When Janet Williams appeared in Amora's doorway moments later, her face was pale in the dim light from the hallway. "Get dressed," she said simply. "We need to go. Now." Detective Morrison had been blunt in her phone call. Intelligence gathered from multiple sources indicated that tonight would be different. This wasn't going to be another intimidation attempt or psychological warfare. A group of approximately 20 men, including several off-duty officers from neighboring jurisdictions, were planning what they called a final solution to the Amora problem. The Williams house, which had been their fortress for weeks, was no longer safe. As they threw essential items into suitcases, Amora's phone rang. John Cena's voice was urgent but controlled. "Are you and your mom ready to go?" "Go where?" Amora asked, stuffing clothes into a bag with shaking hands. "Somewhere safe. Dwayne and I have been working with Detective Morrison and the FBI. They've arranged a secure location." "The FBI?" Amora's voice cracked. "This is really that serious?" "Amora." Cena's voice was gentler now. "They are not just coming after you anymore. The intelligence suggests they are planning to make this a public spectacle. They want to send a message to anyone else who might think about standing up to corruption." The next hour passed in a blur of flashing lights and hurried conversations. Federal agents appeared at their door, professional and efficient, escorting them to armored vehicles that looked more suited to a war zone than a suburban neighborhood. As they drove through the dark streets, Amora watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. The place where she had grown up, where she had felt safe, was now a target, all because she had refused to let a corrupt cop steal a bracelet. The safe house was a nondescript building in an industrial area outside the city, surrounded by federal agents and local police who had proven their loyalty beyond question. Inside, Amora was surprised to find John Cena and Dwayne Johnson waiting for them, along with Detective Morrison and several people she didn't recognize. "These are FBI agents Collins and Martinez," Morrison explained. "They've been investigating a network of corrupt police officers and their civilian allies for over a year. Your case became the catalyst that brought everything into the open." Agent Collins, a serious woman in her 40s, spread photographs across the conference table. "What we're dealing with isn't just Marcus Grayson anymore. It's a coordinated network of individuals who see your actions as a direct threat to their worldview." The photos showed men in tactical gear, weapons caches, and communications intercepts that painted a picture of an operation that had grown far beyond a simple revenge plot. These people weren't just angry. They were organized, well-armed, and absolutely committed to silencing the voice that had dared to challenge their authority. "The good news," Agent Martinez added, "is that we've been monitoring their communications. We know when they are planning to act, and we know how they plan to do it." "Tonight," Detective Morrison said grimly, "they are going to your house at 3 a.m. They think you're still there, hiding and afraid. What they don't know is that we're going to be waiting for them." Amora felt her stomach clench. "You're using me as bait." "We're using their hatred against them," Agent Collins corrected. "They've committed to this course of action. Whether you're there or not, they're coming. The difference is that now we can control the situation." Johnson leaned forward, his massive presence somehow comforting in the sterile conference room. "You don't have to be anywhere near this, Amora. You and your mom will be safe here while we handle the rest." But Amora was already shaking her head. "No, I started this by standing up to him. I'm not going to hide while other people finish it for me." "Absolutely not," her mother said sharply. "I won't let you put yourself in danger again." "Mom, I'm already in danger," Amora replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We all are. These people aren't going to stop just because I'm hiding in a safe house. If we don't end this now, we'll be running forever." The room fell silent as everyone considered her words. Finally, Agent Cullen spoke. "Even if we agreed to let you participate, and I'm not saying we would, what exactly do you think you could contribute?" Amora thought about it for a moment, then looked around the room at all the adults who had risked their careers and their lives to protect her. "They are not really coming for me," she said slowly. "They are coming for what I represent. They are coming because they can't stand the idea that someone like me could challenge someone like them and win." "That's exactly why you need to stay away," Cena interjected. "No," Amara continued, her voice growing stronger. "That's exactly why I need to be there. They want to silence me, to make me disappear. But what if, instead of hiding, I showed up? What if I stood there and faced them one more time?" Detective Morrison frowned. "That's an enormous risk." "Everything about this is an enormous risk," Amora replied. "But if I hide now, if I let fear make my decisions for me, then they've already won. Even if you arrest all of them tonight, there will be others. There will always be others until people like me stop being afraid to use our voices." The debate continued for another hour, with law enforcement professionals arguing about tactical considerations, safety protocols, and legal implications. But eventually, a plan began to emerge, one that was risky, complex, and completely dependent on perfect timing. At 2:45 a.m., Amora found herself in the back of an unmarked police car, wearing a bulletproof vest that felt heavier than her entire body. Her mother sat beside her, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter's hand. "I should never have let you talk me into this," Janet whispered. "You didn't let me do anything," Amora replied gently. "This is my choice. It's always been my choice." The neighborhood was dark and quiet as they approached the house, but Amora knew that behind every shadow, in every parked car, federal agents and police officers were waiting. The trap had been set with military precision. At exactly 3 a.m., they came. The convoy of vehicles moved down the street like a mechanized army, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Pickup trucks, SUVs, and motorcycles, at least 15 vehicles filled with men who had convinced themselves that violence was the answer to their wounded pride. Grayson's vehicle led the procession, and even through the tinted windows, Amora could see his silhouette in the driver's seat. He had brought an army to wage war against a teenage girl, and the irony of that wasn't lost on anyone watching. The vehicle stopped in front of the house, engines idling as doors opened and men emerged. They moved with the coordination of a military unit, some carrying weapons openly, others trying to maintain the pretense that this was something other than a planned assault. Grayson stepped out of his truck, a megaphone in one hand and what looked like a military-grade rifle in the other. In the harsh glare of the streetlights, his face was a mask of hatred and determination. "Amora Williams." His voice boomed through the megaphone, echoing off the empty houses. "We know you're in there. You wanted to play with the big boys. Now it's time to face the consequences." The house remained dark and silent, exactly as planned. From her position 3 blocks away, Amora watched through binoculars as the scene unfolded. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone in the surveillance vehicle could hear it. "Come on out! Girl!" Another voice shouted, one of Grayson's allies, emboldened by the darkness and the numbers. "Let's settle this like adults." That's when the floodlights hit them. Dozens of high-powered spotlights illuminated the street like daylight, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy. FBI agents, state police, and local officers emerged from their concealed positions with weapons drawn and voices raised in unified command. "Federal agents, drop your weapons. Get on the ground now." The night exploded into chaos. Some of Grayson's men immediately threw down their weapons and surrendered, realizing they had walked into an elaborate trap. Others tried to run, scattering in different directions only to find their escape routes blocked by law enforcement officers who had been waiting for hours. A few, led by Grayson himself, chose to fight. The gunfire was brief but intense, muzzle flashes lighting up the street like deadly fireworks. Amora watched in horrified fascination as the man who had haunted her nightmares for weeks finally faced the consequences of his choices. Grayson tried to use his truck as cover, firing wildly at the federal agents surrounding him. But he was outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. When the shooting stopped, he lay face down on the pavement, handcuffed and bleeding from a shoulder wound, his dreams of revenge shattered like glass. The entire operation was over in less than 10 minutes. When the dust settled, 18 men were in custody, including 3 active police officers from neighboring jurisdictions and 2 former military personnel with extensive weapons training. The arsenal they had brought was staggering, enough firepower to level a city block. As the last of the suspects were loaded into police vans, Amora was finally allowed to approach the scene. She walked slowly down the street she had traveled thousands of times before, but everything looked different now. The houses seemed smaller, the shadows less threatening, the very air lighter. Grayson was conscious as they loaded him into the ambulance, and his eyes found hers across the chaos of the crime scene. But instead of the burning hatred she had seen before, there was something else: defeat, exhaustion, and perhaps the first glimmer of understanding about the monster he had become. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of sirens and radio chatter. "Why couldn't you just stay quiet?" Amora looked at him for a long moment, thinking about all the fear, all the sleepless nights, all the ways his actions had changed her life and the lives of everyone around her. "Because someone had to," she said simply. As the ambulance doors closed and carried Grayson away, Amora felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: peace. Not the peace of someone whose battles were over, but the peace of someone who had fought the right fight and emerged victorious. Detective Morrison approached, her face showing exhaustion but also satisfaction. "It's really over now," she said. "The whole network is blown. Grayson will be facing federal charges that will put him away for decades." Amora nodded, but her attention was focused on the crowd that had gathered at the edge of the police perimeter. Neighbors, news crews, curiosity seekers, all drawn by the spectacular conclusion to a story that had captivated the nation. Among them, she spotted familiar faces. John Cena and Dwayne Johnson stood together, both wearing expressions of pride and relief. They had kept their promise to protect her, even when it meant putting themselves in danger. But there were other faces, too, young faces, teenagers like herself who had been following her story, drawing inspiration from her courage. They held signs with her picture, wore T-shirts with justice slogans, carried themselves with the confidence of people who had learned that their voices mattered. As the sun began to rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Amora realized that this had never really been about her. It had been about the idea that truth could triumph over power, that justice could prevail over corruption, that a single voice raised in defiance could inspire others to find their own voices. The battle was over, but the war for justice would continue. And now, instead of fighting it alone, Amora knew she would have allies, an army of young people who had learned that courage was contagious and that standing up for what was right was always worth the cost. Marcus Grayson had wanted to silence her voice. Instead, he had amplified it beyond anything she could have imagined. And in trying to destroy her, he had destroyed himself and the corrupt system he represented. Justice, Amora thought as she watched the last police car drive away, really did have a voice. And it sounded like hope.